Welcome to the Pivot Point Podcast. This season, I'm focused on sharing stories and ideas from experts on diversity and inclusion. In this episode, I will share some insights and ideas from my guest expert, Bonnie Fetch. Together, we will leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. We share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together. We are one. So we're going to introduce Bonnie here in a minute, but I wanted to fill you in on Bonnie's wealth of experience that she's bringing to the show today. I had the chance to meet Bonnie a couple years ago when she moved to the Central Indiana area, and we became fast friends. My first job out of college was at Caterpillar, and Bonnie worked at Caterpillar for many, many years and rose through the ranks as a female executive. And I remember her sharing the story of as you move up, how there's fewer and fewer women there, which actually led to her writing a book called Unskirting the Issues and talking about gender in the workplace and tools for women to be better as leaders, but also men as allies. So she calls them the well-intentioned man with all sorts of tips for what I would call our male allies to enjoy and participate in the conversation around gender equality as well. So not only that, but she has a wealth of experience in logistics, manufacturing, product design, human resources, organizational development, executive leadership. And she now is the executive director at Cummins here in Central Indiana. So I'm so excited to have you, Bonnie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Julie. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, fill us in. How did you get involved in this line of work? What sparked your interest in things like women's leadership and equality in the workplace?
I really had my aha moments about 6 or 7 years ago when I was interviewed for a book that someone was writing on the topic of gender inclusion, and then in an interview that the company that I was working for at the time was running to understand the barriers and why more women weren't getting into senior level leadership roles. And of course, the questions in those interviews are around, what do you attribute your success to? And I've always attributed my success to, investing in people and working hard and, of course, being in the right place at the right time and a little bit of luck. But the follow-up question in both of those interviews to me was, if that's true, why aren't there more women in the pipeline? And I'll have to admit that that was the moment that I realized I was part of the problem. I hadn't that there weren't enough people, women specifically, in the pipeline, and that I hadn't myself been promoting women and the need for more women in the pipeline. I had been worrying about my own success and not even recognizing that when I looked behind me, we were woefully shy of other women in the organization ready to take on more senior level roles. So I started doing some, internal reflection and also some networking and investigating about the company's numbers, looking more broadly than the company, and decided that I had been part of the problem for 20 years, not believing that there was such a thing as a glass ceiling. I needed to be the individual, or hopefully one of the many individuals that actually made a difference before I.
Well, that's so vulnerable to share that. I appreciate you sharing that with our listeners. And I remember when you shared that with me, it's hard, I think, sometimes when you look in the mirror and we realize, oh, wow, I'm not keeping other women down by any means, or not advancing other women, or doing anything really in particularly negative. However, I could be doing more, right? And to keep that mantra, that story going of, hey, it's just hard work, the myth of meritocracy, we have the equal chance, and to continue to answer questions that way kind of doesn't highlight that there still is a problem, there still is a gap. And as a leader, it's my honor, right, to participate in this conversation and to look first in the mirror of what could I be doing to support and advance the conversation around women, rather than pretend like it's not a problem.
Absolutely. And when I had those aha moments, it just so happened that not so long after, we had a tornado in the city that we lived in, and we lost all of our belongings and our home, which was an unpleasant event that I wouldn't want to repeat. But it really caused me to reflect on life, and what could have happened if there was injury or loss of life in my family. And then 2 weeks after that tornado, my first grandchild was born, and she happened to be a girl. And so my commitment to my granddaughter and my daughter and daughter-in-laws is that I will make a difference so that she doesn't have to experience the work environment that so many women have experienced over the last number of decades.
I know. Isn't it young people that really inspire us? Like, okay, it was all right for me and maybe even the next generation, but not for her. And if you
Absolutely.
think about something like gender equality here in the United States, I mean, we're 208 years away. And it's hard. Having a 5-year-old daughter myself, I find it very difficult to reconcile that. And I'm sure it is for you with your grandchildren as well.
Definitely. And I think as a mom of sons as well, I have a son and a son-in-law that are both playing a bit of a role reversal. So they're supporting, the predominant part of child rearing and taking care of the home to support their spouses at this particular stage in life. And it turns out they're facing the same challenges. So it's just a realization that while we sometimes think of this as a women's issue, and it is in fact, and has been affecting women for decades, there are all sorts of individuals, men, people of color, people with, in the LGBTQ community that are different than the majority and face challenges. And so for me, it's beyond gender, right?
Yep.
It's let's fix gender challenges because we have the biggest opportunity there with 50% of the population being female. But let's also recognize that when we're identifying the barriers and fixing some of the challenges that hold women back, we're actually going to help a much broader group of individuals than women.
Yeah. And you and I share that journey as well. I thought as a white, straight, cisgender woman that my only voice in the diversity and inclusion conversation was about gender for the longest time. And then I came to realize a few years ago, thankfully, how intersectional the experiences are and how much we are stronger together and how gender can actually be a catalyst, a springboard, if you will, to some of the other dimensions. But now that I've started to see difference from the LGBTQ community, from people of color community, from the disabilities communities, it's really hard to unsee it. And we need our allies. And the male allies message actually translates really well to white allies, straight allies, able-bodied allies. We need all sorts of allies to engage in the conversation. So I'm curious, Bonnie, for your book, Unskirting the Issues, I remember getting it. I actually ordered it before I met you. I remember meeting with you and you gave me a copy and I'm like, I already have this book. I'm curious, what led you down the path to think, hey, we need to reach out and get other people educated in the conversation that may not think they have this voice in diversity and inclusion. And in fact, they're the ones we need the most, right? Because they've got the power, they've got the privilege, they have decision-making capabilities in most organizations. What led you to want to write this book, and how has the conversation evolved since you wrote it?
Yeah, fundamentally, I wanted to write the book along with my co-author because we were frustrated with the lack of progress. And through my own experimentation of pulling men and women together in conversations about gender and the challenges that women face, I became really aware of the fact that many men, number one, weren't aware of the challenges. They, even if they were aware of some of the situations that happened in the workplace, they tended to think that they were one-off situations. And so in having these, open conversations with men and women, I could see that men were concerned and in many cases really surprised. And I also heard from many of them that they didn't know what to do. So it's one thing to become aware that there's a challenge. It's another thing to know, what do you actually do when you become aware of it? And when you have a responsibility because you're part of the majority to actually help make a difference, what are some practical things that they could do? And so it gave me the idea that perhaps, if awareness was the first step, then maybe the second step was actually giving some practical advice and helping men to know how women are feeling and thinking and experiences that are not one-off, but pervasive, and how they might actually take small steps initially and build confidence to take bigger steps in this space of being allies. And we also wanted to give women a voice, that sometimes women think, well, this isn't my situation and maybe I need to do something different. And what we found is that when women hear our stories, I and my co-authors, and I know you share stories as well, they say, wow, it sounded like you were telling my story. And it gives me the confidence to talk about how it feels when that sort of thing happens to me, whether it's, being interrupted in meetings or being perceived as incapable of doing a big job because I have children. So it was really twofold. It was to help men actually put the next step forward and become engaged in a meaningful way. And then also for women to find their voice and to engage men as well. Because I do believe for decades, women have been talking to women about these issues. And my belief is, we can't be mad at men for not being part of the solution if we're not actually inviting them into the conversation.
Yep. Yeah, you and I agree full-heartedly on that point. Closing the door and be like, no boys allowed isn't really the best method of change.
Exactly.
And, a lot of early women's conferences, women just didn't have a safe place to connect. And so they needed to close the door and vent and to realize my story is not just my story. It's like there's a collective narrative here. And so often that single story is used against underrepresented people to think it's just happening to you. It reminds me of the conversations I've been having. I agree with you, and we're still at the basement of awareness with a lot of people inside organizations because the conversations I've been having with Lead Like an Ally, my new book that you were so kind to endorse, about a woman's journey through corporate America and opportunities to facilitate inclusion. What people told me, especially white men, were, was that just what happened to you? And I don't think they were trying to be dismissive. They just thought it was that simple. Like, oh, that must have happened to you. Like, is this really a thing, Julie? Meanwhile, this, Bonnie, just like with your book, every other woman is like, yes, this is so my experience and more. And so I really try to distill like the 30 things that I've heard, at conferences, the questions people ask me after I speak, the messages I get on social media. These are the things I know that are a collective experience. And it's really important that we honor that and help people understand this is not just something that's happening to you. It's happening more widely. And if you're somebody that hasn't experienced this, wow, what an opportunity to be an ally. What an opportunity to leverage your privilege for positive change. And so, Bonnie, I know we're both storytellers. We love sharing stories and telling stories. And I'm curious, from your vantage point now inside an organization focused on diversity and inclusion, doing a really nice job with the gender piece of it at the senior level. What do you see, or what have you seen collectively from your corporate America career as, times when we've got it right, maybe times when we haven't, stories or lessons that you could share with our listeners?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think in the places that I've seen that get it more right than wrong are the places where there's both real senior level expectation and belief that diversity drives better business results. And I see that at Cummins, right? We have a CEO and an executive team that have very clearly done a lot of introspection. They understand, why they think and feel the way they feel. They recognize where they fall short because we all have bias. We all do things sometimes that we think, oh, that was biased and I shouldn't have done it, right? Where I think we get it right is when the executive team actually believes it. They set an expectation for the organization and they make space for people to do grassroots efforts. And so, be it breakthrough leadership for women, breakthrough leadership for men, creating environments where women can explore what has been holding them back and how they can improve their own level of confidence and willingness to speak up, but then also identify barriers in the organization. And then educating men, right, on what are these things that happen in the workplace that aren't one-offs that we need to be aware of, and move from unconscious bias to being more conscious that we all have bias, and how can we guard ourselves from making decisions automatically without thinking about how we bring our bias to the table. So I see it here, and I always tell Tom Linebarger how impressed I am that he tells his story of being raised by a single mother, and how he really believes in the need to make changes, not only in his own company, but within our society, and how he still gets it wrong sometimes. And then he makes space for other people to go through their journey and to bring ideas for how we can do things better as well. Where I've seen it work not so well is when we talk about it because it's the thing to talk about, but we don't actually put real actions against it. And I think the companies that I've seen that talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion, but don't move the needle, really don't address some of the systemic issues, actually frustrates employees more than not talking about the importance of it. And so I've seen organizations where women and people of color leave because they think, you're talking about the importance of it. So we had some hope that things would get better, but we actually don't see anything changing. So it feels a bit ingenuine, and we're going to leave. And so I think, there's not one thing, which is probably what makes this such a challenging topic to actually, how do we make progress faster? Because it's the little things that we have the opportunity to do every day to be more inclusive, more so than the one initiative. And I think a lot of companies and individual leaders are looking for that quick fix. Like, what's that one thing that I can go do and make it better? And the reality is it's a bit like just leadership in general. It's about the little things you do or fail to do each and every day that are going to make a difference.
Yeah. It's that whole paradigm of what you say versus what you do. And it's one thing to say, and I think it's really important to say why it's important, especially from the highest level mouthpiece, which you've got. And it's such a common trait, by the way, for our allies to have a strong female influence in their life. So the strong female, the mother, not a requirement, but always helpful. But I think what you're sharing with our listeners that's so tangible is it's not just talking about it, it's doing something with it. And I think that's where most organizations are really struggling. They might have a diversity awareness training, they might do some onboarding, they might have the senior executives talking about it. But what I see, and I'm curious on your vantage point, what you've seen inside companies is this middle layer. The middle manager seems really lost in the middle and just not sure what to do sometimes. And they're often responsible for the majority of the employee experience. And so it's hard, I think, to know where to start. What have you seen work well, especially with that middle layer of management? Ideas on how we can reach that level. I know many of them report up through your organization. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you, by the way. It's often, if you pick any challenge in an organization, the poor middle managers are always the place that, it's first of all, one of the hardest jobs in the company, right? Because you've got a lot of people that depend on you for leadership. And then you've got a lot of people above you, that are giving you all kinds of different priorities and expectations. And so I do think it's a tough job. And I think what happens sometimes with middle managers is they don't always get the level of coaching and development that more junior employees get. And so they're often left to kind of figure it out. And so what I have started to see senior leaders do is talk about diversity and inclusion very much in the context of what it takes to be a good leader. Like, it isn't you lead people and then you do diversity and inclusion as, kind of a side job, but actually, being inclusive is part of being a leader. And so being very explicit about behavioral expectations. And one of the, I think, most successful things that I've seen is really helping people to understand that in order to be an inclusive leader, you actually have to know yourself. So people often think, well, to be a good leader, I need to understand my people, and I need to understand what it means to be a leader, and all the jargon that we talk about with regard to what makes a good leader. But actually, in order to be a great leader, which in my mind is equivalent to an inclusive leader, is actually to understand yourself. Understand what makes you tick and what ticks you off. Understand how you make decisions. Understand how you make assumptions about people. Understand when you feel uncomfortable, what makes you uncomfortable. I, in my book, talk about the reverse gender test. And I advise both men and women to use the reverse gender test. When you have a negative emotion or a negative assumption about someone of the opposite sex, ask yourself, would you have that same opinion of whatever that action or behavior was if it was, for example, if you think that about a woman, would you think that if a man said or did exactly the same thing? And if the answer is no, then you might have, identified a bias that you need to be aware of. And so, there's a quote that I won't get right about, there's a lot of things that are hard, nothing harder than a diamond, except for knowing oneself. And it's a lifetime journey. And so I think the most successful thing that I've seen in leaders that have become inclusive is leaders that have actually spent time to understand who they are, why they are the way they are, why they think the way they think, and they're truly authentic. And those areas where they need to learn from other people and where they need to be vulnerable and say, I screwed up. I made an assumption or I made a decision and it was unfair or it was wrong and I'm going to work on it, as opposed to, leaders that have a ton of blind spots that they, they're sort of on autopilot, and unless somebody calls them out, they don't recognize.
When they get so defensive. I talk about that a lot with my diversity and inclusion friends and other practitioners. People seem to get so defensive about this conversation. I'm not a fill in the blank ist. It's like, that's not what we're saying. It's just a natural part of this process is getting things wrong. And that's actually okay, because there's no one right way to do this. Be open to that feedback and be open to giving your team that feedback so it can be better. And I couldn't agree with you more. I see inclusive leadership as it's part of being a leader is being inclusive. Part of being inclusive is being a leader. These things are two sides of the same coin. So the more inclusive you are, the better leader you are. And in fact, a lot of the content that I get requests for on inclusive leadership is very much core to leadership, stuff I've been teaching for the last 10 years. Coaching skills, listening skills, vulnerability-based trust. They're not new concepts, but I think when threaded together under the filter of inclusion, people can see, oh, okay, this is my job. This is a thing to do, especially for folks in the majority group. I think there's really, the more male and white and, more majority categorizations you have, just less likely you are to see yourself as a part of this D&I conversation. So it's really saying, oh, okay, this is part of the human experience. This helps me be a better leader. Okay, this is a conversation I absolutely should be involved in, rather than kind of, to use your word, skirting away from it.
Right.
So Bonnie, I'm curious from you, being in an organization that's very much on the forefront of this, very progressive and actively taking steps, not just talking about it, but walking the talk as well. What do you see in the future for diversity and inclusion in the workplace? Where do you think this conversation is evolving to?
I think it is, we have so long to go. We've made a lot of progress in a lot of companies, but if you look in aggregate, we just have so much more work to do to improve the diversity in senior leadership, to improve the diversity in boards, to help individuals feel like they can bring their whole selves to work. And so I do think that there's a lot more that we need to continue to do to help people to become more self-aware, to help people to learn more about unconscious bias, to make it more conscious. Because as long as it's unconscious, we can do nothing about it. When it becomes conscious, we can do something. So I think probably one of the simplest things that I think companies are recognizing that they need to do more of is provide space and time for this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Uncomfortable as it might be. And in some conversations, in some companies, it's way more uncomfortable than others. But to get leaders that are vulnerable enough to say, we've got to have this conversation, because the reality is the talent war is a real thing. And employees are walking. Employees want, particularly the younger generation, but I think, even people in my generation, they want to be able to bring their whole selves to work. And if they don't feel like they can do that, they'll find somewhere else. And so companies that want to win are going to have to figure out how to make space for this kind of conversation, identify the barriers that exist in the organization, and start tackling them. Whether that's the way we write job descriptions, whether that's the requirements that we have for certain roles that are largely based on, 20 or 30 years ago, what it took to do that job. We are not going to be able to retain or attract talent. And frankly, the world's getting more complex. The problems are getting more challenging. The technology is causing things to be a pace that we've never seen before, and there's no sign of that slowing down. So talent's really important, and you can't talk about talent without talking about diversity and inclusion. And so I actually think that we're going to double down the efforts and approach it more holistically, as opposed to approaching it from a diversity and inclusion perspective, approaching it from a talent, attraction and retention and leadership and work environment perspective.
Yeah.
Because if we don't, we're going to be in trouble, particularly companies that have relied on, sort of cradle to grave kind of employment opportunities.
Yeah, you and I worked at one of those.
Yes.
Yeah, and a lot of companies, they've been fortunate, 30, 40 years, employees stayed. We know that's absolutely not the way the workforce is. And you're right, it's a talent shortage out there, so you have to be competitive. And what we know about the next generation, Gen Z is the most diverse group of a generation entering the workforce. Now, that's usually true of every younger generation. But the thing that's different about them is they see diversity and inclusion as a non-negotiable. They're not going to work at a company that's not diverse and inclusive. So I think thinking about the future, right? You're right. This has to be embedded in our processes and looked at just like we would any talent development strategy, cultural shift. It has to be a part of how we do business. And what's really interesting too, and I know Cummins discovered this, I love this story about, and you probably could tell the story way better than me, but I heard the story secondhand from one of your executives that they realized that they had to double down on gender, I think more than 10 years ago now. I want to say it was probably 12 to 15. And really advocated to get more women, especially in the senior leadership team, because they knew that they wanted to grow and develop in communities more. And when women were involved in leadership in developing communities, the communities grew faster. So suddenly there's this business case, right?
Yeah.
And then everyone rallies around it. And guess what? You have, at what percentage are y'all at now? I know it was in the 30s.
In the executive level, we're over 30%.
Yeah, which is critical mass, which we know to be huge to shifting that dynamic. So I welcome, your perspective of that story, Bonnie. I'm telling it secondhand. You're probably much better at sharing it. But it was so compelling the way that message was amplified throughout the organization.
Yeah, it really is. I think that, there's, as you know, loads of research that confirms, society's benefit when more women are in the economy and more women are growing in their employment and their financial status, right? And we haven't published anything to this regard, but if you look at Cummins' published financial records, there was a period of time when we were pretty flat year over year from a sales perspective. And right about the time we hit 30% leadership being female, we started to see fairly significant growth. The growth trajectory from 2010 to 2019, fairly significant. And if you look at this, I think it was 6 years preceding that, pretty flat. Now, it's very difficult, to call it causation, but it's supported by the research that says when you have a more diverse set of executives, different styles, different perspectives, solving problems, leading a company, you get better business results. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's the case here.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I love how you painted that picture. So that really helps, I think, some of our listeners that might have that zero-sum game mentality or defense to diversity and inclusion. Well, we can't just promote women or fill in the blank people just because, right?
Right.
And somehow we're taking jobs away from somebody else. Well, that whole story shows there's more seats at the table for everybody, right? We're all better together. The pie gets bigger versus my slice versus your slice. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And
Sure.
of course, there's other factors, but we know McKinsey, Harvard, a lot of reputable organizations have been reporting these numbers for years. So I suspect that had a lot to do with the financial success.
Absolutely.
Well, Bonnie, just wrapping up the interview here, it's been fascinating. I love talking with you about these issues. It's such a shared passion that we have for this work and knowing your lens of being, a senior executive inside a huge global company. I'm curious, if we could just narrow it down to one thing, the bandwidth of people I find to process D&I conversation is, I just need a baby step, it's something to do. And I know you mentioned bias and some other things, other tools out there, but if you could just pinpoint it to one thing that you think would really highly impact people if they could take one step, what might that be?
I often give this assignment to men when we talk about gender, but I think it's applicable. You could fill in the blank, any type of diversity. But I have asked men on numerous occasions, just go talk to a handful of women that you actually know at work. You have, a relationship with. Don't go up to a random stranger, and ask a simple question. What does it feel like to be a woman working at our company? And just listen. Don't respond. Don't defend. Just listen. And if you ask a few people, I am certain, in fact, it's been confirmed to me many times, there's a theme. And almost every man that I've asked to do that has come back and said, wow, I had no idea. Mm-hmm. And so imagine if you could fill in, how does it feel to be, we all know, there's several people that I work with that are LGBTQ. How does it feel working in our company, right? Mm-hmm. Right? And it's insightful. How does it feel to be, a foreign national now living in the U.S. and working at our company? Right. How does it feel to be a person of color, right? And I say don't go up to a random stranger because it can be quite offensive to just randomly ask that question.
You want to have some trust first.
Yeah, exactly. If you know someone though, and you are legitimately curious, and you ask to understand as opposed to asking to rationalize or defend, I am certain that people will gain insights and be surprised by what they learn. Mm-hmm. So I think that for me is the simplest step that anybody can take. Mm-hmm. It requires some courage, but it's really insightful.
Mm-hmm. I learn something every time I do that. And one kind of recommendation, I've done that a lot and I recommend that a lot. I think you're right. Just don't do that to just anybody or a stranger on the street. You want to know the person a little bit, have some trust built with them so that they feel like you're asking with good intentions. And just one caveat to it too is that don't expect that person to represent the entire group of people's experience. I
Right.
I just had lunch with a couple of my friends that are African American, and they were just venting about, oh my gosh, if another white person asks me what it's like to be a black person in America, I'm just gonna scream. And they're like, I know that it's good intention, but like, I can't explain what it's like for everybody. I said, don't put the onus on that person to describe the entire experience. But, if you show the right level of empathy and curiosity and good body language, they're not gonna get that message. It's just
Right.
all about how you say this. And I think a window into somebody's world, it's so powerful, and one of the most powerful techniques to building allies and becoming an ally, and just asking about somebody's experience. What's it like to be you? Tell me.
Right.
I'm
Yes.
curious. And you learn and go into it with a place from curiosity and willingness to learn. And like you said, park those defenses and just listen. And you will become, I know I have become a better human by asking those questions. But it's hard. It is hard. If it was easy, we'd all be doing it.
Absolutely.
Well, Bonnie, thank you again for these insights. I know I always learn when I talk to you, and I know you have an intense travel schedule and lots of things vying for your time. So thank you for spending time with me and our listeners today.
Yeah, thank you for all the work that you continue to do, Julie. I know together we are making a difference, and I hope we can accelerate progress.
I know. We need everyone involved in the conversation. Well, Bonnie, if our listeners have questions or want to reach out to you, what's the best way to follow you to stay in touch with your message?
I am on LinkedIn under Bonnie Fetch, and I also have a website, unskirtingtheissues.com, where you can read some blogs and get information about the book, and also contact myself and my co-author.
Awesome. Awesome. So we'll be sure to link to that in the show notes. And thank you again, Bonnie, for being with us. Well, did you know that you can find all 5 seasons of our 50 plus episodes at nextpivotpoint.com? And you can sign up for the complimentary 7-day preview of our new program, Lead Like an Ally, and order our new book, Lead Like an Ally. I appreciate you listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Hit the share button. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. Simply search Julie Kratz, Kratz. I post every day. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger. We are one.